boardroom issue? And are UK businesses taking IT security seriously enough?
Ask yourselves and your colleagues, do I know what good looks like in cyber? Right? And then you'll know whether, when it comes to the board, it will certainly come on the board agenda, you know what the right questions are to ask to ensure you know you're going in the right direction. That's the next step we need to take together as an economy.
I definitely think that it's on the board agenda in most organisations in the UK and actually indeed in most developed nations. And the reality is it's not just going to stay on the board agenda, but it's probably going to increase in importance as the number of these attacks increases. As an economy, as a society, we're more connected, more digitised, more interdependent, and of course we're leaning further into technology in order to develop our businesses and indeed the business advantages. So these two things do come hand in hand to a degree. But as I think Kevin has just suggested, there is a difference between being on the agenda and actually being an item that we're confident we're addressing to the degree that we're happy with the risk. And I think most organisations are still at the point in which they're having to grapple with that. I think often as well that for large organisations, that is something that they may do more often than smaller organisations, and maybe at the highest decision-making level, but yet increasingly that is happening, and we're seeing those questions being asked in smaller organisations, and that's just going to increase.
So given that the blue chip companies that I mentioned, BA in particular, will have, invariably they're going to have very sophisticated, expensive and well-resourced IT systems, yet they're still suffering breaches. Are these attacks the problem of blue chips? Are blue chips the target, or is it relevant for the businesses in this room?
It's certainly relevant for the businesses in this room. One of the things that happens with the smaller businesses, is that it tends to be reactive. So they have a problem and then they seek a solution to it, rather than being, as we're trying to do, is educate people about it. Our approach has always been to take the issue to them, show it how it could affect them, and then let them choose how they want to deal with it. The difficulty we're having is that there's not enough of us doing it in the sector, so we're finding a lot of people in the sector are still not being spoken to about the risk of cyber and how it might affect them, and therefore they see risks happening and leaks with British Airways, with people like that. It's not relevant to them. They see data, people talk about data, and it's not helpful to them because their most likely thing is going to be some sort of crypto locker or theft.
Alison, with the FCA issuing that fine, are we expecting regulators to show more teeth when issuing fines, and is this likely to be an increasingly common trend?
I think the interesting thing about that status is that it's an FCA fine. I think for the banks, as you identified, a lot of them have been affected by cyber, but for businesses, it's more likely to be the Information Commissioner and the fines that they will impose. So I think the focus has been very much on the fines. 4% of global revenue, so huge, and for Tesco, who knows what that number would be if it was an ICO rather than an FCA fine, but the fine is for a breach that happened pre-GDPR coming into existence. But I think it's all of the additional cost, and I'm sure that's something that we should cover on this panel. I think there's a big misunderstanding by business owners, small and large, of truly what it will cost. So the reputational damage, for example, for BA will be huge. What's the impact going to be on the share price, the customer loyalty? All those things have a price.
What do you think the trend is likely to be for UK SMEs in terms of actions? Is the ICO going to show its teeth, and what are we looking at the 20 million euros or 4% of global turnover type fines?
So the most recent fine that the ICO handed out was to Equifax in the UK, and Equifax got the maximum fine under the old data protection legislation, which was obviously the 1998 Act. We've now got, of course, the 2018 Act to reflect some of the aspects of GDPR. And the issue for any organisation is that if there is a serious breach and the risks to the rights and freedoms of individuals is so severe that in the Equifax case it was. It's a huge number of individuals, financial information, all sorts of different types of impacts on their lives, whether it be financial or social disbenefits. Then the ICO does take a very dim view of that, and they have reflected that in the maximum fine that any company has ever received, which was Equifax just a couple of weeks ago. And it was only £500,000 under the old regime. The maximum fine today, as you suggest, is 4% of global turnover. That's global turnover, so that's Equifax Inc., not Equifax UK Limited. So that's going to be a phenomenally large figure if the same type of issue happens to Equifax again.
Is cyber exclusively a technology problem?
No, it's definitely not. Not in my experience, but I'm not the most techie person in the world. But I think it's just part of it. I think people hide behind the tech, thinking that's where they're getting all their ticks. But actually, it's much more, for me, the people element, the training, people who were in the business, people who have left. Certainly the Morrison's data breach, that was an ex-employee. So I think you have to focus on the people. You need to have a change in culture, as I think Kevin said. We are in a very different world.
You touched on something really important there, which is culture. So if you have a culture of a small business of the leader is the leader of the business and you do their bidding, you can get a technology person who's running the IT systems who's too frightened to say we're vulnerable because he's expected to make the place safe. Now, it's impossible for him to do that, or her to do that. It is just not possible for them to do. So what is the communication, what is the culture that leads to that change in mindset so that people go, okay, we're doing everything that's reasonable to make ourselves safe with technology. What else can we do? And how else should we be looking to mitigate our risk? How well do we understand it? One of our big challenges is always getting people to understand that actually privacy is just one of the risks you face. And it's certainly for most people who operate in bubbles, recruitment consultants, people like that, where they've got a very captive audience, their biggest risk is actually reputation. It's what happens when they lose their clients' data that is the thing that makes it viable or not for them to trade on. So technology is only part of it, but it's about the culture of entwining that with everything else that the business does that I think is so important, and it's the change that needs to happen.
It's interesting. We've thrown a lot of big names around today, Tesco, BA, with all the fines and a lot of talk about GDPR. I think it's interesting that we go into the same sort of clients, whether they're SME or mid-market, and talk to them about their cyber exposure and use those examples to try to get them to realize their own cyber risk for them. For us, we're now seeing about 4 incidents reported to us from a cyber perspective at CFC underwriting a day. And if you look at that in comparison to the UK, only 10% of people as businesses actually purchase a cyber policy. So the risk is increasing and increasing, and we take a breakdown of where those are actually coming from. Privacy is actually only about 12% of what that is. And to us, that means we should absolutely focus on privacy. It's not going to go away. It will always be there. But for a lot of companies, there's so much more than that. And I think a few people here touched on the point of reputational harm. That isn't just a privacy event. It's no matter what happens to you from a cyber perspective. So your systems go down. For every day that your systems are down, how much revenue are you losing? How many customers are you losing? How many people want to deal with you throughout the rest of the year? Social engineering fraud, electronic compromise, fake CEO, vendor supplier scams. How many people have we talked to that's happened to where they haven't had a privacy event, but they've actually had suspected attempts of that occurring to their business? So I think it's just a matter for us of just changing the conversation and not focusing on privacy as the sole means of everybody having a cyber exposure.
Ultimately, as business owners or risk owners or leaders within our organisations, what you're really after is changing behaviour. And that's not just about what people do with technology or how people interact with technology. I've already talked about the changes in society. That's super exciting, and we can talk about that later on. But actually it's about how people consider this risk as far as their responsibility is concerned. Do your people within your organisation understand that they have a responsibility, both to themselves and their families, and to the wider business, to look after this information in a way that will help you avoid some of these challenges?
Just to back that up, one of our partner insurers tells us that 80% of the current losses they're dealing with come from some form of human error.
How is the landscape changing between hacker activity and targeted attacks to untargeted attacks, which is malicious software sitting in the cloud, going after everyone like an airborne virus?
I think that what we've seen, unsurprisingly, like all good business models, when it comes to cybercrime, is an evolution of the model. And the fact of the matter is that anyone who says that crime doesn't pay clearly doesn't know the same criminals that I've come across, because it does. And as that payment continues, people will find easier and more effective ways in which to do that at a greater scale. And so we've seen that with cybercrime, unsurprisingly, and that means that everybody's affected. The reality is that if you wanted to target a large organisation, you wouldn't attack the large organisation. You would look for the chinks in that organisation's armour, which is often in the supply chain, and the organisation's more reflective of those of us in this room than maybe some of the people that we supply.
What do you believe is the most common or frequent form of cybercrime? And is there a particular group of SMEs that you think are vulnerable or likely to be targeted?
So I would say it's absolutely ransomware. We're starting to see that increase more and more each day. And if you look back at CryptoLocker, which is arguably the most popular form of ransomware, CryptoLocker made $30 million in its first 3 months, and only 1.3% of the people actually paid the ransom. So to cast a net as to how wide that is and how many people they actually were able to infect with ransomware is quite broad and quite significant. The most vulnerable to us are SME clients.
If you want to put cyber on the board, don't call it cyber. Call it, what would we do if our largest customer stopped doing business with us? Well, that's tangible, and that would be a possible outcome of your systems are breached and your biggest customer no longer trusts you. Or what would we do if we could no longer take customer orders? And what would happen to our cash flow? That's the issue for the board.
What are the most important things that the people in this room should take away from today's seminar? And if someone doesn't say buy a cyber insurance policy,
I think it's identifying the risks for me, and identify the risks and then see how they can best manage them.
Slightly differently, maybe, but actually not to see it as the end of the world. I would suggest that looking at people, process, and technology, and looking at in those 3 areas, and making sure that you're covering off on those areas.
Certainly to have backups. Number 2, develop an instant response plan. And number 3, buy a cyber insurance policy. The costs on a reactive perspective are always so much more than the proactive, and that's something that a cyber insurance can actually work with you to help get up to standard.
Get your contracts right. Get your notices right. And the third thing, and this is absolutely 100% critical, get your rights processing right.
Identify your exposure. And your exposure is not only your risk you face in terms of your technology and your people and things like that, it's also what you're doing contractually. And we have clients that are signing contracts where they're undertaking to have certain amounts of cyber insurance and things like that, and they've just not got that covered. So they're already not complying with the contracts. You need to understand that. Secondly, mitigate. So what we mean by that is that even if you buy insurance or you don't, you still have to mitigate your risk. You still have to take measures to try and understand and then address those shortcomings that you find through your risk assessment. And the third thing, of course, is transfer. By that, transfer your risk to a cyber insurance policy. You can't make yourself 100% safe. You want the help when it happens.
Get your executive team or board to do a 1-hour simulation of the commercial consequences of a catastrophic breach. Yeah, that will pull out the legal issues, the cultural issues, where the risk is being transferred to insurance. If you know where your data is, a properly run simulation like that would also crucially, make those alpha types on your board understand that this is not a responsibility they should dump on an individual in the IT department because it's all a bit difficult, right? This is something they should bring up to show leadership on.
My thanks to the panel, my thanks to Kennedy's for co-hosting with us today and being our partners. So thank you all very much. Please show your appreciation for the panel.